you to the National Design Studio's website, which I don't love, and in a minute, you're gonna see why. Now, National Design Studio, which I'll be referring to as NDS throughout this video, reads more like a tech startup than anything else. And the site itself doesn't really tell you much beyond the mission statement language and recruiting copy. Like, it's very boilerplate and very in your face with how hip and cool it is. You know, very Silicon Valley. And then with NDS. Now, you potential spaces and made sure the public could net him to their board of directors. Yes, in fact, the seat he took had just been vacated by Larry Ellison. Yes, that Larry Ellison, the founder and chairman of Oracle. And hold on to old Larry Berry and Oracle in the back of your head, okay? Because this is going to come back up in a moment. Then in August of 2025, Donald Trump signed an executive order creating a brand new federal office called the National Design Studio. This is also when he created the brand new federal title to go with it, the Chief Design Officer of the United States. And Joe Gebbia was named that title on day one, and he reports directly to the White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles. Which is bizarre, right? I mean, a National Design Studio reporting to the White House Chief of Staff, like, that's not how this works. Why is it working like that? Well, it's because the National Design Studio is staffed under a federal hiring authority called Section 3161, which was originally written for temporary advising bodies. And since they're working under that authority, that means almost everyone working at the National Design Studio is either a part-time advisor or a volunteer. You know how billionaires like to volunteer their time for federal design agencies, and so they don't show up on the White House salary report, nor do they file any financial disclosures that the public, who has a financial stake in what they're doing, can see. They were also not confirmed by the Senate, and they answer to no inspector general because the executive office of the president does not have one. Well, where have I heard this before? See, a brand new office inside the White House, staffed by people who are invisible to the federal disclosure process, answering to no independent oversight. Where have I heard that before? Oh, that's right, because that's exactly how Doge was run. And Doge, lest we forget, in its very short, very horrific run, gutted federal agencies, fired tens of thousands of career civil servants, and is currently the defendant in multiple federal lawsuits. And more specifically, those lawsuits are for letting engineers access Social Security data and the Department of Homeland Security data and share that sensitive federal data with outside parties trying to overturn elections. That Doge. And what do you know? I found in my investigation that Joe Gebbia and connects a little. There's a limestone mine, keeps 450, and I know the first thought you have not been able to digitize protections that the Federal Office of Personnel requires paperwork. And so Joe calls and called it a day. Now, I wanted to learn more about what he was doing with National Design Studio. So I started this investigation onto the digital infrastructure that the White House now controls. Yeah, instead they just worked around the legal guardrails and called it a day. Now, I wanted to learn more about what he was doing with National Design Studio. So I started this investigation like I do all of them, by following the money. Except I hit immediate roadblocks because I remembered that this is all being done off the books, right? Just like Doge did. I mean, there are no contracts on USA Spending. The office is not registered on SAM.gov. As a federal procurement entity, the National Design Studio doesn't technically exist, which is probably the point. You know, because it was certainly the point with Doge, so I don't see why it would be any different here. And so I did what I always do when I can't follow the money. I followed the data instead. I promise you, following the data is just as good as following the money, and you can't cover it up as easily, because data always leaves behind residual data. It leaves behind a little trail, like dust on furniture, what Larry Ellison's company had been doing for the last decade. I remember reading about the time that Oracle ran this network of tracking tools that were embedded across the internet to build what they were internally calling digital dossiers. And basically they were these files of very sensitive information on people containing like where you lived, where you bank, what you buy, your political views, your race, like everything. And Oracle's CEO Larry Ellison at one point in 2015 was even publicly bragging on stage, claiming that the company had dossiers on roughly 5 billion people. And I go into these digital dossiers in more depth in another video, which I recommend watching after this. But the TLDR is this. In 2022, Oracle got sued in federal court for building those files without consent. And in July of 2024, they had settled for $115 million and shut the entire operation down. But that operation was obvious. Joe was the site that because these session recordings were being disguised to make it look like they were going back to Trump RX, to your browser. But in actuality, there's a script in the JavaScript that is actually forwarding it to PostHog. And the thing is that this is a technique that companies have been using to get past ad blockers for ages, right? But this is not the kind of thing that you expect to see on a federal drug pricing website. And so I'm alarmed, right? And I decided to go look at the other websites that this office had built to see if it was doing the same thing. And what do you know? Yeah, It is. I mean, this includes the realfood.gov, the federal food policy site, Trump accounts, the Trump Children's Savings Program or whatever it is, and even the studio's own homepage, ndstudios.gov. And so all of them have the same vendor, right? The same setup. The IP address is not stripped, the same trick to hide where all the data is going. But I noticed something particular with ndstudio.gov, and it was only on ndstudio.gov. There was this second system that was running alongside PostHog that someone had built entirely by hand from scratch. It was this long string of code, about 540 lines of JavaScript with a name embedded right into the code. It was called AutoMonitor. Now look, I'm no professional web developer, so I sent it over to a friend of mine who is a web developer and is much more into the computer smarts than I am. And from what he can tell, you expect to see on a... Oh, yeah. It is. I mean, this includes the realfood.gov, the federal food policy site, Trump accounts, the Trump Children's Savings Program or whatever it is, and even the studio's own homepage, ndstudios.gov. And so all of them have the same vendor, right? The same setup. The IP address is not stripped, the same trick to hide where all the data is going. But I noticed something particular with ndstudio.gov, and it was only on ndstudio.gov. There was this second system that was running alongside PostHog that someone had built entirely by hand from scratch. It was this long string of code, about 540 lines of JavaScript with a name embedded right into the code. It was called AutoMonitor. Now look, I'm no professional web developer, so I sent it over to the outside world. So basically everything with no public page. So nobody answers when you knock. Now, I want to be honest about what I can and cannot prove here. From what I can see, AutoMonitor is only loaded on the studio's own homepage, which is kind of weird, right? I mean, if the goal is to surveil Americans, why wouldn't you put it on something like Trump RX? Why put it on a website that almost nobody knows exists? But every PostHog recording on every one of the federal sites that's linked with the NDS website at the bottom, to the best I can read, passes through the studio-controlled infrastructure on its way to PostHog. And so that would mean that the studio has the structural ability to keep a copy of every recording as it passes through. And so this was pretty concerning to me, right? And so the next thing I wanted to know was whether or not there were other sites that the studio just hadn't announced yet. And here's a fun fact that not a lot of people outside of security research knows about. Every website that has that little padlock in the address bar has something called a certificate attached to it. And there's this rule in the industry that anytime a certificate is issued anywhere in the entire world, it has to be logged in a public ledger the second that it's created. And that's right, there are no exceptions and no opt-outs. And the lovely side effect of that rule is that now every new website on the internet, even the ones that nobody's announced yet, or even if it's hidden behind some kind of login, leaves a public fingerprint the moment that it's built. And even more lovely than that is that there's this free search engine called crt.sh where anybody can look up any of these logs. And so I typed in the studio's domain with a wildcard, which is just a little asterisk at the beginning of it as a way of telling it to show me every certificate ever issued for any subdomain under ndstudio.gov. And the search took about 30 seconds, and what it came back with was... yeah, it returned with no less than 40 more entries attached to ndstudio.gov. None of them announced anywhere with no links pointing them from any public page. And I just need to read some of these names off to you guys, okay? Because these were sites that looked like they belonged to different, department Excel sheet with the domain, subdomain. Ones that were most concerning to me is typically what developers will put. But a few of the ones that were most concerning to me were the ones like nasaforce.staging.ndsstudio.gov, passports.staging.ndsstudio. ndstudio.gov. By the way, staging is typically what developers will put when they're building a website and they've created the certificate, but it's not quite ready. It's the staging website. And the two that really concern me, votegov.previews.ndstudio.gov and FBI Kirk tipline.previews.ndstudio.gov. Now, let the record show that these are federal agencies, which means that they do not belong to the National Design Studio, right? These don't belong to the National Design Studio, right? Yeah, well, about that. I checked the public ownership records for each of these subdomains, just to be sure, and every single one of them, all 40-something that I could find, traced back to the same place. The Executive Office of the President. Yeah, so the National Design Agency has built pre-launch domains, just to be sure, and every single one of them, all 40-something that I could find, traced back to the same place. The Executive Office of the President. Yes. So the National Design Agency has built pre-launch versions of websites that look like they belong to federal agencies and registered them all to the White House. Because remember, the White House is the executive office. And when things are under the executive office's control, it means that they don't always have to have congressional oversight, i.e. the ballroom. And look, there's a lot we need to unpack about the passport thing and the FBI tip line for Charlie Kirk, and we're going to get into all of that in a second, okay? But first, I needed to know who was running the infrastructure underneath everything. Well, every NDS site had the same label attached, Cloudflare, which is a private company that hosts and protects a huge chunk of the internet. Now, using Cloudflare is not necessarily abnormal for a federal agency, but running for... Let's read that again. Cloudflare account is another matter entirely. And all gated preview sites funneled into one single login screen that read... loveisaskill.cloudflareaccess.com. Let's read that again. Loveisaskill.cloudflareaccess.com. That is something. That's something. And there was a phrase that in the comments, do you think love is a skill? What, you're naming something that belongs to the way. When the federal government, it requires notice, found none of that. 2 weeks after... Two things cannot be true. Straight to jail, right now. And because this was all pissing me off, I wanted to be very clear at who I was pissed off at. So I started looking for the people who were working at National Design Studio besides Joe. And it wasn't easy to find this information because there's no list anywhere that states who they are, right? But I read the bylines of the studio's blog post. Request. There's no list. CEO Larry Ellison at one point. Not what, you're naming something that belongs to the federal government. Why? And look, there's a lot we need to unpack. Phrase that he had been... But running 40 federal websites through one single private Cloudflare account is another matter entirely. And all gated preview sites funneled into one single login screen that read loveisaskill.cloudflareaccess.com. Let's read that again. Love... built pre-launch versions of websites that look like they belong to federal agencies and registered them all to the White House. Because remember, the White House is the executive built pre-launch versions of websites that look like they belong to federal agencies and registered them all to the White House. Because remember, the White House is the executive executive office. And when things are under the executive office's control, it means that they don't always have to have congressional oversight, i.e., the ballroom. And look, there's a lot we need to unpack about the passport thing and the FBI tip line for Charlie.